Hello again. In this lecture, I want to talk about perhaps the greatest philosophical novelist of all time, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, Dostoevsky's works are enormous and vast and incredibly dense, with plots and subplots and characters and philosophical arguments. And so you'll almost certainly have imagined reading Dostoevsky, but I'm not sure that you have read Dostoevsky. If you haven't, as with so many other things, I strongly urge you to do so as soon as you finish this lecture. Dostoevsky's works repeatedly struggle with what happens to humans when they operate outside of the restraining realities of vivid and organic religious belief in conditions of a rapidly modernizing society, such as was the case in his world, the world of 19th century Russia. His own experience of life imitated a great deal of his novels, and in fact, his own life is worthy of its own novelization. He was born into a complicated family, as all really rich, complicated, and dense, noble Russian families were, in 1821. His father was a violent alcoholic, although Dostoevsky and his father seemed eventually to come to a good relationship. His mother died when he was 16, and his father died when he was 18. He fell in love with literature and fell into a circle of liberal intelligentsia, young Turks in Russia who were thinking about how to engage in Western thinking and bring it into the Russian culture in the most powerful and useful way possible. In that circle, though, he became involved with some people who were on the outs with the secret police in Tsarist Russia. And he was arrested and sentenced to death. Astonishingly, and imagine this happening to you, he was actually in a cell and led out with a number of other people to stand before a ditch facing a firing squad, where his sentence was proclaimed, and he believed sincerely that the firing squad was about to shoot. And then his sentence was commuted to 4 years of exile in Siberia, and he was led away to exile. Whenever I think about that, I just can't get over the thought of standing at something in his mid-20s and imagining that he's about to die, and then suddenly hearing that his life was going to go on. Clearly, that would make almost anybody psychologically a more complicated figure than they had been. It did that to Dostoevsky. Prison in Siberia was very hard, incredibly brutal, but it served to shape his views profoundly. And over time, in and out of prison, in prison first and then out afterwards, the experiences also in his life of especially addiction to alcohol and gambling gave him intimate acquaintance with obsessive, compulsive, and addictive behaviors that he identified really, with sin. Over the course of his life, he became increasingly a Slavophile, someone who believed that the destiny of Russia was to come back to its own organic roots and find in those roots the salvation of the whole world against the dangerous depredations of the acidic suspicions of Western European modernity. And he had a profound religious experience, which made his always nominal, and more than nominal in many ways, commitment to Russian orthodoxy, the absolute center of his life. The rest of his life was tumultuous. Several marriages, one wife's death, again, alcoholism, gambling, addiction, a final remarriage, and flourishing in his last decade. But his mental worldview was pretty much set by the 1860s. He died in 1881. Throughout his working life, he was obsessed with the challenge of the intellectual currents coming from the West, and especially with those intellectual movements that attacked traditional morality and religion. Dostoevsky himself felt the powerful pull of these currents. He was drawn to them as a young man, but he found himself finally unsatisfied by them, and indeed led astray by them, led down dangerous paths. His famous line in The Brothers Karamazov, "If there is no God, then everything is permitted. is meant to be a summary of the thoughts he often explored. And in this way, we can, in fact, see him as a little bit like Nietzsche, though drawing the opposite conclusions from Nietzsche. Both saw the new ideas of their time as powerfully revolutionary and refiguring everything, shaping the way society and the human should understand themselves in completely revolutionary ways. But whereas Nietzsche thought these ideas were good and exciting and should be furthered and we should progress with them, Dostoevsky felt that the ideas were nightmares that would lead to a new age of barbarism and inhumanity, and that the most important thing he could do was identify their full meaning, diagnose their pathologies, and warn his countrymen to stay as far away from them as they could. To understand this, it will help for a minute just to get a grip on the category of nihilism that is pervasive in a lot of Dostoevsky's work, and also in some of other thinkers' work as well. Nietzsche, we'll see Albert Camus talk about this as well. Nihilism is the belief that in some sense there is no moral structure, and not just no moral structure, but in some ways no absolute framework to the cosmos, that the cosmos is in some important way, morally and perhaps in other ways, up to us, all a matter of our will. The world is what we make of it. The thing for Dostoevsky about nihilism is it's an enormously seductive idea, and it's an enormously empowering idea, but he also thinks ultimately it doesn't work with the psychology of humans to finally believe in nihilism. The terror for Dostoevsky is not that people can say they believe this. The terror is what they do when they're in the grip of this belief. You don't have to take their belief literally, he thinks, to take it seriously. Whether they express it properly or not, they are in the grip of a powerful idea that has terrible, deleterious effects both on them and on those around them. Now, I want to talk about two great works he wrote. One, sometimes called The Possessed or The Devils, properly really entitled Demons, and the other in English called Crime and Punishment. Together, these two books offer a powerful set of challenges to where evil is going, as Dostoevsky worries about it, as the 19th century lurches to its close. Now let me talk about The Possessed or Demons first. In this work, in Demons, Dostoevsky struggles to argue, try to figure out a way of saying that the desire of revolutionary modernists in Russia and elsewhere to improve society founders on their failure, their own fundamental failure to understand the nature of evil. They fail to understand this in their own natures, in the nature of how evil manifests itself in warping their collaboration, their allegiance with other revolutionaries, and also, more basically, their failure to understand how evil is the problem that they are themselves trying to confront and overcome. Now, this book has a really interesting publication history, actually, and its career in Russian is worth mentioning. It gets published in 1873, and it's hailed as a great novel right away. And for the next 30 or 40 years, lots of Russian readers tend to it, talk about it, discuss it. Very, very popular and powerful novel. But with the Russian Revolution, of course, it effectively disappears because lots of people in the authority structure of the Soviet Union thought of Demons as basically an indictment of communism and of the revolutionaries that led to communism. There were some dissidents in the Soviet world who, actual bureaucrats who disagreed with this, not just dissidents, but bureaucrats within the Soviet system who disagreed with this and tried to find ways of publishing this work of Dostoevsky's. But effectively, it was completely forgotten in Russia. And then in Perestroika, and then in the 1990s, it became widely available again and wildly popular in Russia. And now again, the Russians laud it as a great novel. Though now, of course, they think, maybe we should have called it, boy, what could we have been thinking, right? Because it seems so prophetic to many Russians about the course of their own country in the 20th century. Now, Interestingly, as a background for this novel, understand that in Eastern Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and especially in Russia, there's not a lot of direct theoretical attention given to Satan, given to the devil in the theologies. Rather, what you have instead is attention to the multiplicity of devils in the plural. Local house demons, forest devils, gypsies, spirits of the swamp, that sort of thing. Dostoevsky uses this tradition, which is a theological tradition but also a folk tradition, to identify, name, and kind of describe the anarchic, squabbling nature of evil, at least as it's manifest in this group of revolutionaries. It's incoherence, both in the individual, in making their actions not really intelligible, most of all not to themselves, and in the group, in making their cooperation in any real way impossible. In fact, evil corrupts groups in such a way that they end up being always at war with themselves. Again, Dostoevsky here is in some important ways a little like Milton. The problem with the rebels is that they're not able to be taken. We can't really properly take them with complete seriousness. But their actions have profoundly deadly consequences. And in this, Dostoevsky is sketching a character, a distinctively modern character, whose figure we will see come up again and again. The figure of the human, whose consequences, whose impact on reality are out of all proportion with their own pathetic, ludicrous reality. That in some sense, there's a tension between the smallness of the figure and the magnitude of the evil that they are able to produce. Whereas in goodness, when we see someone do a great deed, we're normally able to identify that person as truly a remarkable person in some sense. But with evil, it doesn't seem to work that way, at least in modernity. Much of the greatest of the evils of modernity, Dostoevsky is one of the first people to suggest this, much of the magnitude of those evils is caused by people who are really, in themselves, kind of pipsqueaks. And we'll see this especially with Hannah Arendt and her discussion of Adolf Eichmann. But understand it's operative even in someone like Dostoevsky, at least at the imaginative level. Now, another thing, don't worry, we will get to the demons, but another thing to know before we begin is that the very genre of the novel, this is a totally Dostoevskian, classically Russian thing to do, but Dostoevsky thinks the very genre of the novel itself is a product of Western secularity. The novel, right, as an imaginary story, an imaginary creation by a human author of a kind of vivid human world. Dostoevsky finds that enormously theologically problematic. It's potentially, latently a rival to God's creation. Any novel is. And so potentially a novel is intrinsically corruptive. So in Demons, as in all of his novels, he is anxious that the novel not seem too realistic. In this, Dostoevsky is in profound tension with his comrade Tolstoy. Right? Tolstoy was the classic exemplar of the person who writes the great realistic novel. Dostoevsky, for theological reasons, is quite worried that the category of the novel seduces the author of the novel and the readers into a God's eye perspective, which is deeply troubling to him. So one interesting thing about Dostoevsky is he's always worried about the very genre he's writing in, that somehow it might itself be a demonic genre. Now the story of Demons is relatively simple, as 19th century Russian novels go. Peter Verkovensky is a wealthy, young and idealistic revolutionary. Very good with words, articulate, lucid, coming from kind of right-thinking, forward-thinking, intellectual parents, liberal parents. And Verkovensky gathers a conspiracy of like-minded young revolutionaries about him. He convinces them that the conspiracy into which he lures them is in fact part of a much larger trans-Russian conspiracy, maybe an international conspiracy. But in fact, the conspiracy goes no further than Verkovensky himself. It effectively is kind of like a bridge club of secret revolutionaries. He brings into this group one by whom he is himself seduced, the most inspiring and most seductive of all the revolutionaries, Nikolai Stavrogin. Now, Stavrogin is a deeply charismatic figure, often an observer on the margins of events, not able to really be invested or engaged in anything, and profoundly misanthropic, someone who doesn't have a lot of fondness for humans, but also someone who is deeply tortured by his misanthropy, by his hatred of others. And he does some truly horrible things in the novel, including eventually at one point paying someone to kill his mentally retarded wife, Maria. Right? He manages to convince someone else to kill her, and manages to pay them without, in some sense, really coming to grips with what he had done, his full role in this. Dostoevsky is fantastic at representing this kind of evil that happens when we kind of back into a wickedness that we don't ever really fully acknowledge to ourselves is going on. Now, to solidify this group's identity, to confirm everybody in the private club of the revolutionaries, Verkhovensky kills a former conspirator, someone who was in the group but who left, whose name is Ivan Shatov, who he left behind radicalism for Russian Orthodoxy. And after he's killed him, Verkhovensky lets everyone else in the group in on the secret. Right? He's basically killing this guy to bond everybody in the group together. He's instrumentalizing his life for the abstract cause of the group. But the truth of the murder becomes known. The conspiracy collapses at once. Most of the conspirators are arrested by the police. Stavrogin, Nikolai Stavrogin, in the end, is deeply aware of all of his sins, including his complicity with this futile and folly-laden group of pseudo-revolutionaries. And in the end, he commits suicide in despair of his guilt, at his complicity in the murder of Shatov, and in the murder himself of his own wife, and in the whole worldview that surrounds both of these things. Now, as in so much of Dostoevsky, the moral of this novel, such as it is, doesn't emerge neatly at the end of the book. Ironically, it emerges almost in the middle, in the build-up to the murder of Ivan Shatov. What finally causes the break between Shatov and the revolutionaries is that he offers a more morally supple and vivid picture of reality, one where morality matters and where humans are caught in sin. The revolutionaries don't. For the revolutionaries, caught up in the currents of 19th century science and rationalism and philosophical extremism, nihilism again, they want to say that effectively things happen, but that responsibility can't be pinned on anybody. No one is properly to blame, they want to say. All we have to do is create a new world that is in some sense far superior to this. We don't have to worry about the ethical consequences of our actions because they'll be justified by the endpoint we achieve. Remember Marx here. The problem is that a figure such as Shatov, who is coming to appreciate the theological and cultural heritage of Russian Orthodoxy, realizes that it's not true that no one is to blame. He says, famously, in a confrontation with Verkhovensky, we are all to blame. Effectively, everybody is guilty. And that distinction between those who believe that no one is to blame and we are all to blame is for Dostoevsky the most fundamental and powerful distinction that drives the history, as he sees it, of the 19th century. Now, in Demons, Dostoevsky is offering us three important lessons. First of all, he's offering us a powerful account of the nature of evil in modernity. Effectively, it's couched primarily in political terms, right? Politically, it's a structure of revolution against the social order, but more deeply than that, he thinks, it's psychologically about revolting against the conditions of human existence in general. The failure of modernity in the face of this evil, his second lesson. The modern world, the coming into existing modern world, simply does not want to acknowledge the reality of this evil. And it doesn't even want to acknowledge what's more disturbing for Dostoevsky, the modern world's tacit or active complicity with it. Verkhovetsky, remember, comes from a good, a right-thinking family, a liberal family, tolerant, welcoming people, right, who are open to new ideas. But their openness to these new ideas, for Dostoevsky, leads their son into the most grotesque and wicked nihilism imaginable. And third, as a response to this corruption, Dostoevsky proposes that the tradition of radical orthodoxy is probably the one thing that will save at least Russia, and perhaps beyond Russia, all of us. The traditional cultural and religious values, and especially the drama of sin and redemption, the idea of a universal corruption as the first insight, psychologically, politically, morally, that would found a wise and healthy human life, is for Dostoevsky essential to going forward in our context. Now, to turn from demons to Dostoevsky's probably much more famous and certainly more widely recognized as a great novel, Crime and Punishment, is to turn from a powerful novel of political psychology to a powerful novel of psychology in general, and in fact a powerful novelistic portrayal of what it says it is about, at least in English, a crime, and then the inner and also a little bit of the outer punishment that the crime entails. Now, whereas the demons was really about a collectivity of people and how they all kind of collectively led each other to hell, Crime and Punishment really focuses on one person, Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov is a word. There are a few words even in the English language, which in the 20th century and now in the 21st have come to have a certain kind of density of meaning. And if you hear someone talk about someone else as a real Raskolnikov, they're actually not saying a very nice thing about them. Raskolnikov is a poor, failed student in St. Petersburg, a kind of graduate student dropout, right? And he lives a kind of marginal life in a dingy little room, dealing with low lives, trying to figure out what to do with his life now that he's realized that the university is not for him. And in the course of his experience of the city, he comes across a quite nasty woman who's a moneylender and a pawnbroker, quite merciless, and actually clearly who has a lot of money in her rooms. And Raskolnikov decides that he will kill her, take her money, and perhaps, sometimes he seems to think this, sometimes he doesn't. The psychology of Raskolnikov is deliciously, realistically unclear on this. He will use the money, perhaps, to offer some good kindnesses, some charities, some good deeds to people in the city. So one day, he sneaks into her room and he kills her with an axe. And just as he is trying to get away, just as he is trying to sneak out, the pawnbroker's half-sister, Lizaveta, shows up, completely innocent, an innocent bystander. But in order to finish his crime and make sure he gets away scot-free, Raskolnikov must kill her too. And he does. After this, he's completely discombobulated, terrified, and he flees with only a few small things in his hands and a small purse, leaving most of the wealth left behind. But he manages to get away entirely undetected. And unless he confesses the crime, Dostoevsky sets it up, unless he confesses the crime, no one will ever know. So in that sense, the crime is a success. But Raskolnikov is traumatized by it. The event of killing was much worse than he thought, and the consequences for his soul are far more drastic than he could have imagined. He wanders the city in a feverish daze. He ends up giving what little money he has left away to the family of a friend who was a drunkard but has now died. He finds him dead. He finds him, I think he's hit. He sees him killed in the streets by a cart. The daughter of the family, a young woman named Sonia, has turned to prostitution to help her family survive. Right? Again, think of Marx. Think of how brutal the 19th century was, where to help a family live, a daughter had to turn to prostitution. Raskolnikov and Sonia form a bond, and they talk, and Raskolnikov tells her of his crimes, and the torment in his soul because of his crimes. Sonia urges him to confess. After a suitably Russian period of tormented uncertainty and plot twists, Raskolnikov agrees, he confesses, and he is sent to Siberia for punishment, with Sonia following along to help him. Now, this is a novel of incredible density and incredible richness. What's interesting about the book, a lot is interesting, but what's interesting for us is the representation of Raskolnikov's motives throughout the book. Why did he do this? Why did he think going into someone else's rooms, killing her with an axe, would ever be a good idea? What could possibly have motivated that? He seems to have done it because he could, and because he imagined that by doing it, he would be invulnerable to moral guilt or self-condemnation. He would show himself that he was invulnerable in this way. That is, he seems to have convinced himself that by killing someone else with an axe, he would demonstrate to himself that he is the kind of great-souled person he thinks he is. As a student, he had written a thesis entitled On Crime, and in the thesis he suggested that, in fact, there was no such thing as evil. And he compares himself, in several places in the book, he compares himself to Napoleon, admiring Napoleon's sense of ego and will, his strength of purpose, and suggesting that he himself has the ability to make good come of this immense evil by doing good with the cash. But he turns out to be wrong. The murder is botched by the arrival of Lizaveta, and he himself is traumatized by these events to such a degree that he flees the scene without taking the money, and afterwards he can't bear himself until he finally confesses to Sonia. So Raskolnikov turns out to be quite different than what he thought he was, quite different than the story that he was telling himself, a story of 19th century liberal Western nihilism, and how that story he was trying to tell himself was one he wanted to live into. But as Dostoevsky points out, he failed to be able to live into that story. And again, go back to that idea that a novel is a theologically troubling thing for Dostoevsky. Just as Raskolnikov is trying to tell a story about himself, he's trying to be a novelist. Dostoevsky himself suggests the problem with Raskolnikov is precisely that he's trying to usurp God's role. He's trying to tell his story instead of having the story that God gives him be his story. Indeed, the title of the novel, Crime and Punishment in English, is actually something that sounds like it focuses more on the punishment, the official punishment. But in fact, in Russian, the title is much more like Transgressing the Limits and What Happens After. The punishment of the novel itself focuses on Raskolnikov's own inner punishment, not the formal punishment, not the official judiciary punishment. That's actually mostly in an afterword, in an afterthought in the novel. What really the novel's about is, first of all, Raskolnikov's psyching himself up to do this deed, and the enormous stories he tells himself about how he can do this, and then his inner punishment after he's done it. It's mostly a drama that is of Raskolnikov's own soul, absent the official judicial structure. Now, both in what it says in itself and as exemplary of a distinct approach to evil in the modern world, Dostoevsky's vision is a powerful harbinger of the cataclysms that began in the 20th century and that remain with us today. As I've said, it's possible to compare Dostoevsky to many of our earlier authors, maybe especially Milton. But Milton and Dostoevsky do differ dramatically on one thing. Where Dostoevsky sees the problem of evil to lie in any act of rebellion against an established order, the act of rebellion itself is in some ways for Dostoevsky evil. Milton, as we saw him, makes distinctions. For him, rulers who become tyrants, and it's very easy for a ruler to become a tyrant, those rulers warrant their own overthrow. In those cases, rebellion is not evil at all. Indeed, acquiescence in tyranny, whether of Satan's lordship or the king's, is itself evil. For Dostoevsky, in contrast, acquiescence in a powerful authority above you is merely one other way that you are observing the place in society that God has put you in. Now, for a long time, the argument in literature was about who was the greater novelist, the greater representer of reality in prose form. Tolstoy, with his vivid empiricism, or Dostoevsky, with his profound philosophical symbolism and discussions. And that's a vital debate still in Russian literature, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. But for our purposes, a similar question can be asked about who was the greatest novelist of evil. And here there are also two really rival imaginative models, Dostoevsky and Joseph Conrad. You're either for one or the other. In the next lecture, we're going to turn to Conrad and assess the case made for his view as the most profound novelistic representation of evil in the modern world.